I need you to sign these papers. I've waited long enough.
The heavy silence of the dinner table pressed down on Renata like an invisible weight. Her fork scraped gently against her plate, the noise so soft it almost felt like a breach of the quiet that enveloped them. Across the table, Clifford set down his fork with deliberate slowness, as if the motion itself demanded attention. Renata's eyes followed his hand as it moved to the manila folder, the stark, sterile envelope unmistakable in its presence. She watched as Clifford slid it toward her with a quiet precision, almost as if he was placing a thing of fragile importance before her. The sound of paper shifting across the table felt too loud in the stillness of the room. Her heart skipped, a sudden sharp thud that cut through the thick, unspoken tension between them. Divorce papers. Clifford's voice was flat, his eyes averted, unwilling to meet hers. Renata froze. Her pulse quickened, the world narrowing down to that one fragile moment. Divorce papers, already signed, already stamped, already decided. A decision made without her, a finality that had nothing to do with her feelings or her readiness. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat thick and solid, but her mouth felt dry. She didn't speak. She simply stared at the folder. It had been barely 7 days since she buried her father, the grief still raw and settling into the quiet corners of her heart. And now, as if the universe had seen fit to strip away every last vestige of her peace, Clifford was handing her the end of their marriage, like it was a mundane thing to deal with after dinner. No explanation, no words of regret, just the cold finality of a gesture that had been months, maybe years, in the making. Renata's gaze never left the manila folder, the words inside it blurred and distant, like an impossible reality she didn't want to face. She sat still, not moving, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper, as if she could read the weight of the decision through the texture of the envelope alone. Her thoughts drifted, suddenly, to everything she had given over the years. Her time, her energy, the countless hours spent working double shifts, covering for Clifford's dreams, sacrificing vacations, or setting aside her own goals so she could stand beside him in his. She had poured herself into his vision, his landscaping business, the one that had begun with so much ambition and promise. She had believed in it, just like he had. But all of it, the endless late nights, the quiet hopes for something better, had never been enough. There was always something more he demanded. More from her, more from life, more that she could never quite give. She had given him everything, and yet now, as he slid the papers toward her, it felt like she was nothing more than a disposable part of his bigger plan. How many years had she spent bending to his needs, smoothing over his disappointments, only to end up in this moment, watching the dissolution of everything they had built together? How many times had she told herself that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't ambitious enough, driven enough, or capable of pushing herself harder? Clifford had never directly said it, but the words had settled into her skin. He had made her believe that somehow, somewhere, she was not good enough for the life she had been living. He had placed her on the edge of their shared world and made her feel small, as though everything she was, everything she had to offer, wasn't the right fit for the life he wanted. Have you ever been there? Have you ever given someone everything, your time, your money, your best years, only to have them hand you a bill at the end? A bill you never signed up for. A bill that leaves you wondering what you were really working toward all this time. Was it a partnership? Or just a transaction? Renata's breath hitched, but she remained silent. She had no more words to offer. This was a moment where the silent truth hung heavier than any words could express. She realized that, for all she had invested in their marriage, it was never enough for him. And perhaps it was never enough for her either. Renata's fingers tightened around the folder. She didn't open it. Not yet. But she could feel the weight of what it represented. She could feel the unraveling of the life she thought she'd known, the life she had tried so hard to hold together. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet, steady part of her began to shift.
This is how it ends?
Clifford had no idea what was about to unfold. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmare, was that the woman sitting across from him, the woman he had slowly diminished over the years, was about to become worth more than everything he had ever built, combined. She was about to take back control of her life in a way that he would never be able to stop. His business, his investments, the wealth he had built. None of it would matter when the truth came out. Renata's father had left her something. Something quiet. Something patient. Something that had been growing in the dark for 15 years. And the moment she opened that envelope, the moment she discovered what had been waiting for her all along, nothing about her life, or his, would ever be the same. Clifford had never believed in her. He had told her, time and time again, that she was ordinary, that she didn't have what it took. But what he didn't know was that Renata was built of something far stronger than the pieces he had ever recognized. She was not defined by his judgment or the silent, suffocating criticism. She was defined by something deeper, something no one could take from her, no matter how many times they tried. She had been holding on to the wrong measure of herself for far too long. Now she was about to measure herself on her own terms. The moment Renata opened the envelope, it was as if the world held its breath. It wasn't the sharp clarity of numbers that struck her first. It wasn't even the shocking reality of her father's secret, the vast fortune waiting quietly in a digital wallet for all these years. No. What struck her first was the letter. Her father's words, written in his careful, steady handwriting, unfolded before her like a map to a place she had always been meant to find but never knew existed. He had been preparing her for this moment in a way she couldn't have understood until now. "I do not know what this is worth when you read this," the letter began, "but I know it is yours, not yours and anyone else's, yours alone. This is for you to remember who you are, before anyone else told you." Renata sat back, stunned. The words were a balm and a fire all at once. For so long she had believed she wasn't enough, that she had to give and give until she had nothing left to give, all in the name of love, all in the name of loyalty. But her father had seen something different in her, something she had lost sight of herself. The letter was more than just an inheritance. It was the return of perspective. It was the knowledge that she was worth more than what others saw in her. It was a reminder of the woman she was before anyone else's judgment took root.
This is for me.
The money, the Bitcoin, it was life-changing. But it was what her father had given her beyond the wealth that truly mattered, the belief that she had always been enough, just as she was. As Renata sat there, letting the weight of it all sink in, she knew that from this point on, nothing in her life would be dictated by someone else's measure of her. The moment she took back that power, the moment she recognized her own worth, was the moment she began to step into the life that had always been waiting for her. Renata closed the envelope and set it down gently on the kitchen table. The room felt different now, not lighter, but somehow more real. The silence between her and Clifford seemed more defined, as though everything she had been avoiding, everything she had been holding in the quiet corners of her mind, had finally come into focus. Clifford's indifference, his disappointment, his expectations, they all felt smaller now, like things she had been carrying around for too long, but they no longer held the weight they once did. The facade of their marriage, the one he had carefully maintained, had started to crack, and now Renata was holding the key to everything that had been hidden behind it. And now she was about to rewrite the rules. Her story was hers to define, and nothing, not even Clifford's sudden decision, could take that from her. The moment she opened that envelope had marked the end of something, but it had also marked the beginning of everything else. Before we go on, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do so now and hit the bell to get notified about the next part of Renata's journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Renata Osei sat in the kitchen of her tidy townhouse, the muted hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise still house. At 34, she had built a life that appeared reasonable, even enviable from the outside. She was a medical records coordinator at a regional hospital, a stable job that provided for her modest but comfortable lifestyle. Her townhouse, nestled in a mid-sized city, was a perfect reflection of the life she had carefully crafted, neat, orderly, and safe. The beige walls, the beige carpet, the carefully placed throw pillows on the couch, everything was in its place, but it felt more like a set piece than a home. Renata had spent years maintaining this life. She had done everything by the book, following the rules, making sacrifices where necessary, and investing her time and energy into a marriage that had once held so much promise. But now, as she sat at the kitchen table, she found herself staring at the emptiness that stretched before her. The silence in the house was deafening. It was not the calm silence of a home where two people could be comfortable in each other's presence. No. This was a silence that cut through her like a knife, sharp and breathless. It was a silence that spoke louder than words ever could, a silence that had become all-encompassing. This was the life she had built, the life she had sacrificed so much for. And yet, in this moment, it felt hollow, like an empty shell she was still trying to fill. The house, the job, the marriage, they were all just things she had poured herself into, thinking they would bring her fulfillment, thinking they would make her feel seen. But now, she felt invisible, lost in a life that looked so good from the outside, but felt so empty on the inside. The silence in the house was not the kind that invited rest. It wasn't the calm, comfortable quiet of two people content in their own space. No, this silence was different. It was sharp and biting, the kind that filled the spaces between them and refused to be ignored. It hung in the air at every turn, in the stillness that settled over their evening meals, in the absence of laughter that once filled the rooms, in the way their conversations had withered into hollow exchanges. Renata sat at the dining table, her eyes briefly catching the empty chair across from her. She could still remember the days when that chair was filled with Clifford's broad frame, his presence almost a constant hum in the background of their life together. She remembered how, back then, they would share meals like they were the center of each other's worlds, the conversations flowing effortlessly, full of curiosity and laughter. But now, all she could do was watch him, as he ate in silence, eyes glued to his phone, his words short and rehearsed when they did come. It wasn't that Clifford had stopped speaking altogether, it was just that he no longer spoke to her. The conversations they once shared had dwindled, leaving behind an empty space that she was unsure how to fill. The silence had become a wall between them, cold and unyielding, and Renata had found herself growing smaller and smaller in the distance that had grown between them. She knew something had changed in him, something subtle at first, like a shadow creeping across the sun, but now it was undeniable. He had become a stranger in their own home, someone she didn't recognize. It wasn't the loud kind of anger, the kind that comes with explosive arguments. No, this was the quiet kind of neglect, the kind that slowly chips away at a relationship until there is nothing left but silence. Renata's townhouse had once been a symbol of their shared dreams, a space where they had imagined building a life together, a life filled with laughter, love, and the simple joys of living. But now, it felt more like a stage, set perfectly but devoid of any real life. The walls, painted a soft shade of beige, were now muted, almost lifeless, as though they had grown tired of holding up the weight of a marriage that had long since lost its vibrancy. The living room, once a place for spontaneous conversations and intimate moments, now stood quietly, the furniture arranged just so, as if waiting for someone to occupy it. But no one ever did. Renata would often find herself walking through the house, her footsteps muffled by the soft carpet, her eyes gliding over the perfectly arranged pictures on the walls, the tidy bookshelf with books she had long since stopped reading, the empty spaces that once held promise. The kitchen was no different. She moved through it like a ghost, preparing meals that she knew would go unnoticed, setting the table for two, when only one person would be present. The space that had once been filled with warmth, with Clifford's laughter, with the promise of shared moments, now felt empty, sterile. The kitchen table, the same one where they had once sat side by side, now felt like a barrier, a reminder of everything that had slipped away between them. Each room in the house, each piece of furniture, seemed to reflect the state of their marriage, neat and well kept on the surface, but devoid of any real connection. The townhouse had become a shell, and Renata was left to wonder if she too had become something hollow, a mere presence in a space that was no longer her home. Clifford's appearance had changed over the years, but it wasn't just the physical alterations that Renata noticed. It was the way he carried himself, the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way he no longer looked at her like he once had. He had always been tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing in his own way, a man whose presence filled up rooms with effortless charisma. In the beginning, Renata had been drawn to him not just for his looks, but for his energy, the way he seemed to carry ambition with every step he took, how he had a plan for everything and a vision for their future. But now, as she watched him at the dinner table, it wasn't his height or his broad shoulders that stood out. It was the coldness in his eyes, the way they seemed to look through her rather than at her. His once expressive features had become almost unreadable, a mask of indifference that Renata struggled to understand. The warmth that had once radiated from him had faded. replaced with something that made her feel invisible, as though he no longer saw her as the woman he had once fallen in love with, but merely as a fixture in the background of his life. Clifford had become more distant in the past few years, and his transformation wasn't just internal. His appearance had also taken on the weight of his discontent. His clothes had become less sharp, his hair a bit messier, and there was a perpetual weariness to his face, as if the weight of his own disappointment had settled into his bones. He had once carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed in his dreams, and by extension, in their shared future. But now, that confidence seemed to be slipping, replaced by a quiet frustration that Renata couldn't escape. It wasn't just his external appearance that had shifted. It was the way he held himself, the way he stopped trying to make her feel seen. He had become a stranger, and it wasn't just the years or the stress of his failing business that had caused it. Something inside of him had changed, and Renata couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer the woman who had captivated him all those years ago. Renata couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when everything had started to slip away. There had been no one defining argument, no single event that shattered their marriage into 1,000 pieces. Instead, it had been a slow, subtle erosion, like water wearing down stone, so gradual that it was hard to recognize until the damage had already been done. It started with small things. Clifford's growing frustration with his business. The landscaping venture he had been so passionate about in the beginning had begun to falter, and with it, so had his sense of self. Clients were slow to sign on. Promises fell through. The dream he had sold to Renata, the one she had believed in so wholeheartedly, seemed more and more like an illusion. The business wasn't failing, but it certainly wasn't thriving either. And the weight of that disappointment, that quiet but constant pressure, had begun to shape the way Clifford interacted with her. At first, it was just little comments, passive-aggressive remarks about her lack of ambition, about how she had settled into a comfortable life while he struggled. She had brushed them off at first, telling herself it was just stress, just the pressure of trying to make it. But over time, those comments had become more frequent, sharper. "You're too passive," he had told her one night. "You don't push yourself the way I do." The words had stung, but Renata had tried to brush them aside, to convince herself that they didn't matter, that they weren't true. But deep down, they had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. As the months passed, the words had stopped being just words. They had become something else, a silent judgment, a belief that Renata wasn't enough. She had felt it in the way he would sigh when she talked about her day, the way his attention would drift when she shared something that once seemed interesting to him. The affection had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, but ever-present distance. Renata began to wonder if she was simply an afterthought in his mind, a person who had once been important but was now as invisible as the furniture they shared their home with. And so, without any dramatic confrontation or single breaking point, their marriage had begun to dissolve. A slow leak of discontent, of unmet expectations, of a growing chasm between them that neither of them knew how to bridge. Renata had stayed because she loved him, because she believed that love was enough to keep things together. But the reality was different. Love was not always enough when two people were no longer aligned, when the gap between them had grown too wide to close. Clifford had always been the kind of man who could light up a room, his energy contagious and his ambition unmistakable. From the moment Renata met him, she had been drawn to that fire inside him. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was a man who believed in the impossible, who thought that with hard work and vision, anything was achievable. He had a clear path in mind, and Renata, eager to be part of it, had followed him without hesitation. In the early days of their marriage, Clifford's landscaping business had been a vision he was eager to make a reality. It wasn't just a job for him, it was his purpose, his future. When he spoke about it, his eyes sparkled with excitement. He had grand plans for it, a vision of turning it into something that would change their lives. Renata, in turn, threw herself into supporting him, believing in that vision as fiercely as he did. She worked extra shifts at the hospital, gave up vacations, and poured every extra dollar she could spare into the business. She believed in him, in them, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to see it succeed. She would be there for him, always. Renata had never hesitated to put Clifford's dreams first. She didn't even question it. She believed in him, and in their future together. It was a commitment she had made from the moment they said their vows, a promise to stand beside him through thick and thin. She gave up more than she realized, silently sacrificing her own desires for the sake of his ambitions. She worked double shifts at the hospital, putting in long hours that wore her down physically and emotionally. The overtime pay was what helped keep their finances afloat, what helped fund Clifford's dream of expanding his business. Every free moment she had was spent thinking about ways she could help, from designing marketing materials for him to researching ways to expand the business. She never complained. After all, this was the life they had chosen, the life they had dreamed of together. And yet, every time Renata made a sacrifice, she did it with the hope that the business would turn around, that one day they would be able to take that long-awaited vacation, that they would finally have the life they had always imagined. She believed it was only a matter of time. But, over the years, those sacrifices started to feel less like investments and more like compromises. Her dreams were slowly slipping through her fingers, and all she had left was the faint hope that Clifford's success would make it all worth it in the end. Clifford's business, once full of promise, began to stagnate. The energy he had poured into it, the drive that once fueled their shared ambitions, began to fade. It wasn't that the business failed overnight. No, it was more insidious than that. It was a slow, creeping kind of decline, the kind that leaves you numb, unsure when exactly things started to fall apart. Clients stopped coming, the work wasn't steady, contracts fell through, and Clifford's frustration grew with every failed attempt to get the business off the ground. The spark that had once made him so full of life had dimmed, and in its place was a quiet, seething bitterness. It was a bitterness that seemed to have nowhere to go, until one day, it began to quietly shift in Renata's direction. He became irritated with her, not because of anything she had done, but because of everything she hadn't done. "You're too passive," he'd say. "You don't push yourself enough." His words were like a slow drip, one drop at a time, over time, eroding her sense of self. It wasn't just the words that hurt, though. It was the silence that followed. The space between them had become larger and more filled with unspoken expectations, things she couldn't meet, things she didn't even understand. Clifford no longer saw her as an equal partner. She was simply another obstacle, a reminder of the life they hadn't yet built, of the promises that had gone unfulfilled. It wasn't that Clifford had intentionally set out to make her feel small. No, he didn't even realize what he was doing. But as his frustration mounted, he unknowingly turned it inward, toward the woman who had given him everything. The distance between them had grown, slowly, steadily, until Renata found herself trying to fill a gap that seemed wider every day. It wasn't just the things Clifford said that left marks on Renata, it was the way he stopped seeing her altogether. The compliments had faded first, leaving behind a hollow space where they had once been. She could still remember when he used to tell her she was beautiful, when he would notice her laugh and smile as if she were the most captivating person in the room. Now those things were long gone, replaced by a cool indifference. "You're so ordinary, Renata," he had said one night, the words slipping out almost casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to say. "You're just not ambitious enough. You don't push yourself to be better." The way he said it, as if it were a simple observation rather than a judgment, stung more than she ever could have anticipated. And yet, she had brushed it off. After all, it was just one comment, wasn't it? Maybe he was frustrated. Maybe he was tired. She told herself that again and again, because to believe anything else would mean facing the truth, that he didn't see her the way he once had. He no longer admired her. She wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with. She was a reminder of the life he hadn't built yet, a life that seemed so far out of reach, and instead of working with her, he had begun to resent her presence in it. The words came more frequently after that, subtle digs, side comments that chipped away at her self-esteem. "You don't challenge me, Renata. You don't push me the way I need." The criticisms became so routine that she began to believe them, began to wonder if maybe he was right, maybe she wasn't enough after all. The constant weight of his dissatisfaction settled into her bones, making her question herself at every turn. Before the silence, before the distance, there had been moments between them that Renata would never forget, even though they felt like a lifetime ago. In the early days of their marriage, Clifford had been everything she needed. His energy was magnetic, and it pulled her in with an intensity that made her feel seen, heard, and important. They were a team, an inseparable unit, and Renata had loved him with a devotion that was unwavering. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market were their time together. They'd walk hand in hand through the stalls, Clifford's broad hand engulfing hers, his smile easy and bright as they picked out fresh vegetables and flowers for their tiny kitchen. He'd joke about their terrible cooking skills, but they'd laugh anyway, knowing it didn't matter. They were building their life, together. Every moment with him felt like a promise of something more. Evenings on their small porch had once been filled with hopeful conversations, long talks about their dreams, their future, what they wanted to achieve together. Renata could still remember those nights so clearly, the sound of their laughter mingling with the chirping of crickets. They would sip cheap wine, their legs tangled together on the old wicker furniture, their words flowing freely, unguarded. They talked about everything, about moving to a bigger house someday, about starting a family, about their plans for the future. In those moments, Renata felt like she was walking in a world built for two, a world where they were the only people who mattered. But now, those memories had become bittersweet. The man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once made her feel like the most important person in the world, had disappeared. The laughter, the spontaneous touch, the warmth between them, it was all gone now, replaced by the cold distance that had settled between them like an insurmountable wall. Those memories, though cherished, now felt like they belonged to a different life, one that was as far away as the stars. Renata sat back and let the weight of the situation sink in, her mind trying to piece together the fragments of what had once been. She had spent years pouring herself into a marriage that, in the end, wasn't about love but about survival. Clifford had been right about one thing. They had been growing in opposite directions. But what he failed to see, what he never understood, was that love is not always enough to hold two people together, especially when they no longer recognize each other. She had believed that love could withstand anything, that, if they just worked hard enough, loved each other enough, they could fix anything. But now, after all the quiet battles, after all the moments she had sacrificed for him, Renata had come to realize that love is not a cure-all. It doesn't fix everything. And when two people grow apart, it doesn't bring them back together. The painful truth hit her like a wave. She wasn't the problem. She had spent years blaming herself, questioning what she had done wrong, wondering why she couldn't be more, do more, become more for him. But the truth was simpler. The truth was that Clifford had changed. The man she had married, the one who had once looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had, was no longer the man sitting across from her. And no matter how much love she gave, no matter how many sacrifices she made, she couldn't make him be that man again. She wasn't enough for him, and it wasn't because she wasn't trying. It was because he had stopped seeing her as enough. And the moment she realized that, the moment she stopped blaming herself for his discontent, was the moment she started to see the truth about their marriage and about herself. Love is not enough when it's no longer a shared effort, when it's one-sided, when one person is no longer invested. And that was the painful truth Renata had been avoiding for far too long. Kwabena Osei arrived in America with little more than a dream and the willingness to work tirelessly for a better future. An immigrant from Ghana, he took on factory shifts that left his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or loud proclamations. His love was quiet, steadfast, and enduring. He had always believed that the heart of any man lies not in his words but in his actions. With his hands, he built a life, brick by brick, always focused on creating a future for his daughter. Renata's mother had passed when she was just 9, leaving Kwabena to raise her alone. Despite the hardship, Kwabena never allowed her to feel abandoned. He was there every day, guiding her through life's challenges with a quiet strength that Renata would later come to appreciate. His love for her was unconditional, and in his eyes she was always enough. She never doubted his love. He took every opportunity to remind her of her worth, always telling her that she had the power to create her own future, regardless of what anyone else thought. Kwabena's words were simple but profound, and they stuck with Renata throughout her life. He had always told her, "The problem with most people is that they let someone else do the measuring." At the time, Renata hadn't fully understood the depth of his words. But over the years, she had come to realize that her father was teaching her something far more significant than mere advice. He was teaching her to find her own measure of worth, not relying on anyone else's opinion, and not to let the world define her limits. He had known how easy it was to lose yourself. Kwabena had always been a man of resilience, but when he was diagnosed with a progressive lung condition, the stoic resolve he had carried through life began to crack. His illness stole his energy, but not his spirit. Renata watched as he grew weaker with each passing day, his once vibrant body now frail and tired. His visits became less frequent, but the ginger tea they shared during those visits remained a comforting constant. They'd sit together, talk about the past, and sometimes the future, but always with the understanding that time was becoming their most precious commodity. It was during one of his routine visits that Kwabena mentioned a conversation he'd had at work about Bitcoin. At the time, in 2009, Bitcoin was still in its infancy, a speculative idea, little more than a digital curiosity, but something about it caught Kwabena's attention. A co-worker had dismissed it as digital magic money for computer people, but Kwabena, ever the careful observer, took it seriously. He began reading everything he could find about it. A man of few words, he didn't speak much of this new obsession, but his mind was always turning, always searching for something that could secure Renata's future. Kwabena saw Bitcoin not as a get-rich-quick scheme, but as something far more profound. To him, it represented a currency that no government could inflate or devalue, no bank could freeze or seize. It was a financial tool that was outside the reach of institutions that had so often failed him and people who looked like him. Kwabena had watched as the world bent the rules in favor of the few and against the many. Bitcoin, to him, was an act of defiance, a way for people to hold something valuable that belonged entirely to them. Kwabena's decision to purchase Bitcoin wasn't made out of greed, but out of a quiet determination to secure something for Renata, something that no one could take from her. With a portion of his hard-earned savings, he bought Bitcoin at fractions of a penny per coin. It wasn't a large amount, but it was significant to him. He didn't flaunt it or discuss it with anyone, not even Renata. He knew the value of patience, and he understood that sometimes the best things in life take time to mature. He held the coins, waiting for them to grow, knowing the future they could provide. Kwabena had always been a patient man. He understood the value of waiting, of holding on to something that mattered, even when others doubted it. The Bitcoin market surged, and then it crashed. Throughout it all, Kwabena held steady. He didn't sell during the highs or panic during the lows. He trusted in his decision and kept the Bitcoin, not as an asset to be sold, but as something meant to be passed on. Something for Renata, something that would remind her of her worth. His patience, through every spike and dip, was a testament to his quiet wisdom. He had faith in time. Despite the windfall that he knew was quietly accumulating in the digital wallet, Kwabena hesitated to share it with Renata. He had watched her pour herself into Clifford's world, sacrificing her dreams for a man who didn't appreciate her. He feared that revealing the inheritance too soon would only complicate things further, or worse, that Clifford would find a way to claim what was never meant for him. Kwabena knew that Renata had a tendency to give too much, to lose herself in others. He wanted to ensure that she understood her own value before placing this fortune in her hands. When Kwabena felt his time was running out, he knew he had to prepare Renata. He took the envelope, cream-colored and worn at the edges, and carefully wrote her name on it in his steady, meticulous handwriting. Inside, he placed the instructions, the wallet details, and the private keys. It wasn't much, just a few sheets of paper that would change everything for her. But it was the best he could do. The envelope, though, was more than just a set of instructions. It was his last gift to her, a symbol of his quiet faith in her ability to stand on her own. It sat in a locked drawer beneath a Bible and a photograph of a smiling young Renata, gap-toothed and full of life. It was a quiet Tuesday in early autumn when Kwabena Ose passed away. The rain pattered softly against the hospital window as Renata sat beside him, holding his frail hand. She had always thought she would be ready when this day came, but nothing could prepare her for the emptiness she felt when he finally let go. His steady presence, his constant love, was gone. In that moment, everything felt still. When she stepped out of the hospital, her tears fell freely in the parking lot, a release she couldn't hold back any longer. Renata returned home to an empty house, her mind still reeling from the loss. Clifford wasn't home. He had told her he'd be at a business dinner, his usual excuse when he had things to do outside the house. The house felt hollow without him there. The quiet felt too loud now that her father was gone. Her grief sat heavy on her chest as she moved through the house numb. Everything was the same as when she had left, but somehow, nothing felt the same. She didn't know what she was waiting for anymore. A week before, Renata had caught a glimpse of something on Clifford's phone, something she wished she hadn't seen. It was an innocuous glance, a fleeting moment, but it stuck with her like a splinter she couldn't remove. She had seen the texts, messages too casual, too frequent, too familiar. It was a conversation between Clifford and someone she didn't recognize. The words hadn't been loud, but the implications were clear. It wasn't the first time her trust had been shaken, but this time, the cracks were wider. She was carrying this knowledge, the weight of a hidden betrayal. The days after Kwabena's passing passed in a blur. Renata focused on the funeral arrangements, forcing herself to speak to funeral homes and make decisions she never imagined she'd have to make alone. The casseroles arrived from neighbors, the condolences, the well-meaning sympathy. She smiled and thanked everyone, but inside, she felt hollow. The grief that had begun with her father's death spread slowly into everything else. Clifford was there, physically present, but emotionally absent, as if his absence had become a second skin. He was around, but unreachable, like a stranger she once knew. That evening, Renata sat across from Clifford at the dinner table, the tension in the air more palpable than usual. The clink of silverware against the plate fell too loud in the silence between them. Clifford set his fork down with deliberate finality, his eyes avoiding hers. Renata could feel it in her bones. The moment had arrived. It wasn't the first time they had been here, at this quiet impasse. But tonight something was different. There was no warmth, no gentleness left. It was all business now. The silence between them was thick with words that didn't need to be said. Clifford's voice broke through the silence, calm and measured. "This isn't working, Renata. We've been running on empty for too long." His words came like a quiet blow, each one sinking deeper into the space between them. "I don't want us to waste any more of our lives just going through the motions." He said it like it was a conclusion, like there was nothing left to discuss. The weight of his statement hit Renata like a physical blow. She had seen the cracks before, but now they had finally opened into a chasm, one she couldn't ignore any longer. Clifford didn't wait for her to respond. He slid the manila folder across the table, its edges sharp and final. Divorce papers. Already drafted, already signed by his attorney. Already decided. Renata stared at the folder, not sure whether to feel numb or overwhelmed. This was the moment she had been dreading, but it still took her by surprise. It wasn't just the divorce papers, it was the finality in Clifford's movements, the coldness in his eyes, the way he placed the folder in front of her without a shred of remorse. This wasn't just a marriage ending, it was the death of something that had once felt alive. "For both of us," Clifford said, his voice calm, devoid of emotion. The words landed with the quiet sting of a rejection she hadn't expected. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for him to make this decision alone, to treat their marriage like a simple transaction. But he had. He had decided that their life together wasn't worth fighting for anymore. And in that simple phrase, "for both of us," Renata felt the full weight of his dismissal. It wasn't about mutual understanding. It wasn't about working things out. It was about ending things on his terms, not hers. Renata sat there for a long moment, staring at the divorce papers. She could feel the tremor in her hands as she picked them up, running her fingers along the edges. She looked at Clifford, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she had married. But all she found was a man she didn't recognize. The man who had once held her hand and whispered promises to her had disappeared. She thought of the double shifts, the sacrifices, the love she had poured into their life together. And yet here they were, at the end. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, her voice steady, though inside she felt like everything was unraveling. She took the folder, folding it in her hands as she stood up from the table. The house felt colder now, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Renata had been bending for years, trying to make the pieces of their marriage fit, trying to make him see her, hear her. But now, something inside her shifted. The years of sacrifices, the years of being overlooked and dismissed, had taken their toll. She wasn't sure what her next move would be, but she knew this: she would no longer bend. This time, she would stand tall. She would stop giving pieces of herself away. Renata left the dinner table, the folder clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing. She couldn't bear to sit there any longer, to look at him and pretend like she still knew who he was. She walked to the guest room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The bed felt cold, and she sat on the edge, the divorce papers sitting heavy in her lap. "I'll think about it," she had said, And it wasn't a promise to him. It was a promise to herself that she would take her time, that she wouldn't rush into a decision she wasn't ready to make. Alone in the guest room, Renata looked at the envelope she had kept hidden in the drawer for so long. The envelope from her father, the one he had entrusted her with. She hadn't opened it yet. She wasn't sure when the right time would come, but tonight, with the weight of her marriage and her grief pressing on her chest, the envelope seemed to call out to her. She wondered what her father would have said to her in this moment, whether he would have told her to sign the papers or to walk away. She didn't know yet, but she would. In time, she would know. If this story is hitting different right now, if you know someone who has given everything to someone who gave them nothing back, smash that like button and share this video. Someone out there needs to hear this story today. Renata's hands trembled slightly as she sifted through the box of her father's belongings. It was a box she had promised herself she wouldn't open right away, too full of memories and moments she wasn't ready to confront. But today, something drew her to it. Beneath a prayer cloth, worn with use, and a photograph of her graduation, her father's proud, smiling face beside hers, Renata found the envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly worn at the corners, its surface unassuming. Her name was written on the front in her father's careful, precise handwriting. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, not from its contents, but from the weight of what it represented. Renata carefully ran her fingers over the edges, feeling the familiar texture of paper that had endured the passage of time. The worn corners spoke of its age, of its long wait in the locked drawer where her father had left it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, neat, methodical, deliberate. Her father's steady hand had written this, and in that simple act, she could feel his presence. He had meant for her to have this, to find it when she was ready. Renata's breath caught in her throat as she slowly opened the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, the ink still bold and clear. The words were simple, plain, not decorated with flowery language, yet they carried the weight of everything her father had ever wanted to say to her. She could almost hear his voice in each line, steady and calm. "I do not know what this is worth when you read this," it began, "but I know it is yours, not yours and anyone else's, yours alone." She paused, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. The letter went on, and Renata read it slowly, absorbing every word. "This is for you to remember who you are. Before anyone else told you." Her father's message was clear. He had watched her give pieces of herself away, to Clifford, to others, until she had forgotten her own worth. The letter wasn't just about inheritance. It was about her reclaiming herself. It was a reminder from a father who had seen her value before anyone else had a chance to define it for her. Renata sat still, the letter heavy in her lap, the weight of her father's love settling in. Renata set the letter down gently, her hands still resting on the paper as if she were trying to hold on to her father's words, to keep them close for a moment longer. She didn't know how long she sat there, just staring at the letter, processing everything it held. It wasn't just a letter from her father, it was his final act of care, his final instruction to her. It was a gift far beyond money, far beyond anything material. It was his love, his belief in her, something she had been missing for so long. Slowly, she folded the letter and placed it aside. Renata hesitated before following the next set of instructions in the letter. Her father had written them clearly, step by step, as if preparing her for something she might not fully understand yet. First, she needed to download a wallet app. She was unsure what it meant, but the instructions were simple. She followed them precisely, typing in each word, each character as her father had directed. Her pulse quickened with each click. As the app loaded, a strange, quiet excitement rose within her. She didn't know what she was about to find, but she knew it was something important. When the app was set up, Renata entered the private key her father had written down for her. The screen flashed for a moment before displaying the wallet's contents. Her eyes scanned the numbers, but they didn't make sense at first. It was just a screen of numbers, lines of data. She checked them again, then looked up the current market price of Bitcoin. The numbers began to take shape in her mind, and when she multiplied them by the price, the reality hit her. She was sitting on something far greater than she had ever imagined. The weight of it left her breathless. Renata checked the screen 3 times, blinking in disbelief. The number on the screen was staggering, a number that she couldn't fully comprehend at first. Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency that had started as a fraction of a penny per coin. Her father had seen something in it long before anyone else did. And now, those few coins, carefully hoarded, patiently held through every surge and crash, had turned into an amount that was life-changing. She sat still, unable to move, the enormity of the discovery settling over her. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a future she never could have imagined for herself. Renata closed the laptop slowly, her mind still racing to process the revelation. The number on the screen didn't just represent money. It represented years of her father's quiet patience, years of love, of belief in her that had always been there, even when she couldn't see it. She realized she was worth more than Clifford, more than his business, more than all his assets, and certainly more than everything he had ever tried to define her by. She had been living in the shadow of someone else's expectations for too long. Now, she had something that was truly hers, and it was enough. Renata slowly closed the laptop, her hands still trembling slightly. She reached out to turn off the lamp beside her, plunging the room into darkness, but the darkness didn't feel suffocating now. It felt like a space for clarity, for understanding. As she lay back on the bed, her father's words echoed in her mind. This is for you to remember who you are. She hadn't just inherited wealth. She had inherited her father's belief in her, his faith in her ability to stand tall, to measure herself not by anyone else's standards, but by her own. In the quiet of the night, Renata's thoughts turned to her father's message. He had always seen her clearly, even when she couldn't see herself. His wisdom had been the bedrock of her life, the quiet force that had shaped her into the woman she had become. And now, in the stillness of the room, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for his final act of love. His words weren't just about Bitcoin, they were about reclaiming herself, about remembering who she was before anyone else told her. She had always been enough. Now she could finally believe it. As Renata drifted off to sleep, the weight of her father's legacy settled within her. She could see him clearly now, not just as the man who had raised her, but as the man who had quietly given her everything, his love, his belief in her, and now this incredible gift that would change her. Future. She thought back to the moment when he had first told her to remember who holds the measuring stick. She had understood it now, fully. It was hers to hold, hers to define, and no one, not Clifford, not anyone, would ever take that away from her again. Renata woke before the first light of dawn, the quiet stillness of the house pressing in around her. She sat up slowly, the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days still heavy on her shoulders. As she made her way to the kitchen, her mind raced through the events of the past night. Her father's letter, the inheritance, the revelation of her worth. She poured herself a cup of coffee, watching the sky shift from black to pale gray. This was the beginning of something, but what, exactly, she wasn't sure yet. As Renata sipped her coffee, her mind wandered to the backyard. She remembered a time when Clifford had been a different man, before the distance, before the discontent. They had spent an afternoon planting tomatoes together, their fingers in the warm dirt, laughing at their own incompetence. It had been simple, unguarded happiness. At that time there had been no calculating, no measuring, just two people living in the moment. She had loved him then, the way you love someone with no second thoughts, no doubts. But that version of Clifford was long gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Renata stared out the window, the coffee now lukewarm in her hands, her mind drifting between the possibilities. She wondered for a brief moment if she should tell Clifford about the inheritance. It felt like the right thing to do, to share the truth with him, to open the door to a new chapter together. But that temptation lasted only 30 seconds. The memory of the divorce papers, of his cold words, immediately eclipsed any impulse she had to be transparent. He hadn't come to her for a conversation. He had come with a lawyer's paperwork. The temptation faded, replaced by clarity. Renata made a clear-eyed decision not to tell Clifford. It wasn't out of spite, but out of self-preservation. She had spent too many years making herself smaller for him, adjusting to his needs, living within the confines of his vision for their life. This time, she would protect herself first. She couldn't let the knowledge of her inheritance be another thing to be used against her. She wasn't just holding on to money, she was holding on to her sense of self, her right to decide for herself, and that was worth more than anything Clifford had ever given her. In the following days, Renata took control. She learned about asset protection, the importance of legal timing, and the difference between marital property and separate inheritance. The more she researched, the clearer her path became. The inheritance her father had left her was hers alone, untouched by the marriage, protected by law. Renata hadn't realized how vulnerable she had felt until she understood the power she now held. It wasn't just the money. It was the knowledge, the freedom to stand on her own, to make decisions without Clifford's approval. She was no longer as vulnerable as she had felt just a few days before. Renata scheduled an appointment with a family law attorney, a quiet, careful woman named Philippa. She spoke with Renata with clarity and compassion, explaining the options available to her in light of her inheritance. The conversation was illuminating, confirming what Renata had suspected. She had legal protections in place that made her far more secure than she had originally thought. Philippa outlined how to protect the inheritance, ensuring it remained her separate property, and how to navigate the divorce without losing it. For the first time in a long while, Renata felt like she had options, like she wasn't at the mercy of Clifford's decisions. Renata spent the next few days moving through her life with a composed neutrality. At home, she prepared dinner as usual, though her mind was far from the task at hand. When she passed Clifford in the hallway, she kept her face neutral, her expression measured. She no longer allowed herself to be consumed by the small things, by his silence, by the emotional distance between them. The man she had married had become a stranger, and she had learned to wear her calm like armor. She wasn't angry, but she was no longer willing to pretend everything was fine. There was a fire inside Renata now, one that wasn't fueled by anger but by something deeper. It was the quiet, steady burn of knowledge, the realization that she was no longer powerless. She carried this knowledge like a coal inside her, warm and unyielding. It was steady, patient, and it kept her grounded. She didn't need to prove herself to Clifford or anyone else. She had something of her own now, something that no one could take from her. This knowledge didn't just come from the inheritance, it came from finally seeing her own worth. There were moments, though, when Renata wavered. Late at night, lying in bed, her mind would wander back to the early days of her marriage, to the Clifford she had fallen in love with. The man who had once whispered sweet words, the man who had held her hand in public. That version of him still lingered in her heart, the tenderness of those memories undeniable. She wondered if there was a version of their story where things could have been different. But then, the memory of the divorce papers and his cold dismissal would pull her back to reality. The man she loved was gone. But then Renata remembered. Clifford didn't come to her with a conversation, he came with a lawyer's paperwork. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't tried to understand her, or what she had been through. He had made his decision, and in doing so, he had made it clear that he was no longer the person she thought he was. In that moment, Renata knew the truth. No matter how much she wished for things to be different, the reality was that they were not. Clifford had made his choice, and she had to make hers. She couldn't go back. That night, after another cold exchange between them, Renata placed the envelope, the one containing her father's final gift, in the nightstand drawer. She placed it next to the photograph of her father, a reminder of the man who had always believed in her. The envelope wasn't just a set of instructions. It was a symbol of everything she had learned from her father. He had always told her to remember who holds the measuring stick. Now, with this knowledge, Renata had finally taken back that power. She had stopped measuring herself by Clifford's standards. It was a Sunday evening, that quiet lull at the end of the week, when the world seemed to settle into itself. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, a steady, almost soothing noise. The neighbor's dog barked once, then went silent, adding to the stillness of the house. Renata sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The day was winding down, and with it, the weight of her decision. She felt the familiar tension, the silence between her and Clifford, thickening once again. Clifford appeared in the doorway, his posture straight and his arms loosely crossed. There was a purposeful energy to his movements, the kind of confidence that comes from a man who has made up his mind. He stood there for a moment, watching Renata, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the unspoken expectation. This was not the same Clifford she had once known. This was a man who had decided to push through, to demand what he believed he was entitled to, before he could change his mind. "I need you to sign the papers, Renata," Clifford said, his voice calm but firm. "I've waited long enough." His words felt rehearsed, as though he had been building up to this moment, preparing himself for her response. He didn't wait for her to speak, but looked at her expectantly, almost as if this was the inevitable next step. Renata's heart didn't race. It didn't skip. It was steady, calm, as if her mind had already made its decision. She took a moment, studying his face, searching for the man she once knew, but finding only the man who was ready to move on. Renata looked up slowly from the book she had been pretending to read. She met Clifford's eyes, her gaze steady and unflinching. She felt the shift inside her, the quiet realization that she had already decided. Her voice was calm, level, not trembling or uncertain. "Move forward to what?" she asked, her words measured but direct. Clifford's expression shifted, a slight, almost imperceptible change in his posture. His confident stance faltered, just for a moment, as her question hung in the air between them. It was the first crack in his certainty, a crack he hadn't anticipated. "To whatever's next. For both of us." Clifford's response was immediate, like he had already rehearsed it, ready to push the conversation forward. But Renata saw the hesitation in his eyes, the tiny shift in his demeanor that betrayed his confidence. He wasn't expecting this from her, wasn't expecting her to question him, to challenge him. The words "for both of us" came out too easily, as if he believed he had already decided what their future should look like. But Renata wasn't the same woman he had once known. She wasn't just going to accept whatever he said without thought. Renata thought of the texts, the ones she had glimpsed on his phone weeks ago, the ones that had burned into her memory, the words too familiar, too personal. She thought of how Clifford had pulled away over time, withdrawing in small, unnoticed ways until the affection and warmth had disappeared completely. The compliments had dried up. The gestures of love had faded into nothingness. She had watched him, not just physically distant, but emotionally removed, and the silence between them had become more profound than any argument could have ever been. Renata's voice remained steady, but there was an underlying strength in her words. "I'm not ready to sign." The statement was clear, final, and without hesitation. There was no wavering in her tone, no second thoughts. This was not an emotional outburst or a cry for attention. This was a quiet assertion of her own power. Clifford's jaw tightened, a muscle in his cheek flexing as he processed her words. Renata didn't look away. She held her ground, a small but significant moment of resistance. She wasn't going to let him dictate her future anymore. Not like this. Clifford's reaction was immediate. His jaw tightened, and Renata could see the anger flare briefly in his eyes. He had expected her to give in, to sign the papers, to comply with what he had decided. But she hadn't. And now, his frustration showed. He took a step forward, his posture stiffer, his words sharp. But Renata didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She stood her ground, her expression neutral. She wasn't angry, but there was a quiet fire inside her, a determination that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the woman who would bend to his will. Clifford didn't say anything for a moment, but Renata could feel the tension between them thickening. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps heavier than necessary, each one deliberate, as though he wanted her to hear them. The sound echoed through the house, a reminder of the power dynamics that had shifted in that brief exchange. Renata stayed where she was, not following him, not moving to fill the silence. She stayed rooted in the moment, aware that this small act of defiance was the beginning of something much bigger, something she couldn't ignore any longer. Renata returned to her book, or at least she appeared to. Her mind was far away from the words on the page. She had heard Clifford's footsteps fade upstairs, but she didn't feel the need to follow. She didn't need to explain herself to him anymore. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm, of peace. The quiet decision she had made was still settling into her bones. It wasn't about rejecting Clifford. It was about rejecting the version of herself that had been made small for his convenience. She wasn't going to be that person anymore. Renata sat in the stillness of the room, the book resting forgotten in her lap, as the weight of the moment sank in. Something inside her had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic breaking or a loud declaration of independence. It was quieter than that, the closing of a door on a version of her life that no longer served her. She had finally chosen herself. She had finally stopped measuring herself by someone else's standards. Renata didn't know exactly what would come next, but she knew this. She was no longer afraid to stand alone, to make decisions for herself. We're almost at the end of Renata's story. But before we get there, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Renata's position? Would you have told him about the inheritance? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. Who is holding the measuring stick in your life? That's the question Renata had to face. For years, she allowed Clifford's assessment of her to shape how she saw herself. "You're not enough," he'd said. "You're too ordinary." Those words carved grooves in her self-image, leaving her believing she was unworthy of more. The truth is, the lie of not enough is one of the most damaging things we can carry. And more often than not, it's planted by someone who benefits from you believing it. Ask yourself, who is holding your measuring stick? Kwabena's greatest gift to Renata wasn't the Bitcoin, it was the letter. His love for her was never loud or boastful, it was quiet, consistent, and steady. He taught her that real love isn't about grand gestures or lavish displays. It's about showing up for someone day after day and reminding them of their worth. His words weren't just instructions about an inheritance. They were a reminder that she had always had inherent value. That value couldn't be created or destroyed by anyone else's opinion. Real love reminds you that you are always enough, even when you forget. Renata spent years living small, not because that was who she truly was, but because Clifford needed her to believe it. The person who calls you ordinary often needs you to believe that you are. Keeping you uncertain of your own worth makes you easier to control, easier to dismiss, and easier to leave behind when something better comes along. Clifford had done this to Renata without her fully realizing it. She had allowed herself to be made small, to fit into a box of someone else's making. That box had kept her from seeing her own strength. Kwabena showed Renata that patience is not just about waiting for something to happen. It's about trusting the process, trusting time, and knowing that everything has its right moment. Whether it was with his investment in Bitcoin or his steady, unwavering love for Renata, he never rushed or panicked. He didn't intervene at the wrong moment. He made sure that when Renata was ready, there would be something real waiting for her. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is trust them to find their own way, and make sure there's something solid when they do. Renata learned the hard way that a relationship where one person's growth requires the other person's stagnation is not a partnership. It's an arrangement. When she looked back at her marriage to Clifford, she realized that their relationship had stopped being a true partnership long ago. Clifford's frustration and growing indifference had never been about her. It had been about his own dissatisfaction with himself. But instead of growing together, they had drifted apart. Renata had poured herself into him, and in return, she had shrunk herself down to fit into his world, stifling her own growth. Renata had spent so many years staying small, staying quiet, trying to fit into Clifford's vision of what she should be, that she lost sight of who she really was. The cost of staying small is not just about what you give up, it's about what you lose in yourself. It's about losing the parts of you that deserve to be seen and valued. Renata's realization wasn't just about standing up for herself in her marriage. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself she had sacrificed for someone else's vision. It was a painful but necessary awakening. The inheritance Renata received was more than just Bitcoin. It was her father's final act of faith in her. It wasn't about the number on the screen. It was about the way her father had always believed in her, even when she hadn't. His final message to her was clear. You are worthy of more. You've always been worthy. This wasn't just a gift of money. It was a gift of perspective. It reminded Renata that her worth was not determined by Clifford's approval or anyone else's opinion. It was hers alone, something no one could take from her. Living according to someone else's measurements can be dangerous. It can cause you to lose touch with who you really are. Renata had spent so much time measuring herself by Clifford's standards, by what he thought she should be, that she had forgotten to measure herself by her own standards. It took her years to understand that the most important measure of her life was her own. The danger of letting someone else decide your worth is that you end up living a life that isn't your own. And that is a life that will always feel incomplete. Renata's journey to reclaim herself wasn't immediate. It wasn't a single decision, but a series of small ones that led her back to herself. Each step she took toward reclaiming her own life was a step away from the person she had been for Clifford, the person who had measured herself by his standards. She started to define her own path, not out of spite or revenge, but out of a deep need for self-preservation. The woman she had become in her marriage was not the woman she was meant to be. And now she was finding her way back. Renata had never fully trusted in her own strength before. She had always deferred to others, Clifford, her father's quiet expectations, the world around her, to define what she could and couldn't do. But as she sat with her newfound wealth, her father's words echoing in her mind, she began to realize that her strength had always been there. It wasn't something that needed to be proven to anyone. She had the power to choose her path, to take ownership of her life. Trusting in her own strength wasn't just about confidence, it was about acknowledging her right to take up space. Success, Renata realized, wasn't about wealth or achievement. It wasn't about what others saw in her or how they defined her. The real measure of success was about living authentically, about being true to who you are, no matter the external circumstances. Renata had spent years thinking that success meant making Clifford happy, supporting his dreams, and sacrificing her own. But now, she understood that true success was in reclaiming her own life, her own worth. It was in taking back the measuring stick and deciding for herself what success truly meant. And that, for Renata, was freedom. Renata sat in the guest room, a quiet space that had once felt like an escape, but now it felt more like a cage. The house was still and empty, echoing with the silence between her and Clifford. It was a silence she had come to understand. She hadn't signed the papers yet, and she wasn't sure when she would, or even if she ever would. But that was fine. She wasn't in a rush. For the first time in a long time, Renata wasn't desperate to fill the silence. She was letting herself just be. Renata didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. She hadn't yet decided about the divorce papers, and there was no timeline for making that decision. The weight of the choice wasn't something she had to rush. She wasn't going to be pressured into action. Not anymore. She had spent years making decisions based on what others expected of her. But now, she was giving herself the time she needed to think clearly. The pressure to act immediately had faded. She wasn't ready to decide, and in that uncertainty, she felt a strange sense of peace. But there was one thing Renata knew for certain. Whatever came next, she would do it as herself. She would be Renata Ose, her father's daughter, full-sized and clear-eyed. The years of shrinking, of second-guessing herself, were behind her. Renata was no longer the woman who had hidden in the shadows of Clifford's world, trying to be what he needed her to be. She was now standing in her own light, unafraid to take up space. She was learning to make choices that honored who she truly was, not who she was expected to be. That decision, to claim her own space, to stand as herself, unapologetically, was the beginning of something entirely new. Renata had finally realized that she didn't need permission from anyone to be who she was. She didn't need Clifford's approval or validation. The quiet shift inside her, the realization that she had always been enough, was the moment that marked the true start of her life. It wasn't just about the inheritance, or the papers, or even the marriage. It was about Renata choosing to live her life on her own terms, free from external definitions. The greatest inheritance a parent can leave a child is not money. It is the unshakable belief that the child is worthy. Kwabena Ose had given Renata the gift of this belief, a belief she had forgotten for far too long. It wasn't about the Bitcoin, or the wealth, or the property. It was about what her father had always seen in her, even when she couldn't see it herself. His love had been steady, his faith unshakable. And now, as Renata sat in the guest room, she understood that his belief in her had been the foundation of everything she needed. Now, I want you to think about something. If someone has been doing your measuring for you, ask yourself, who gave them that stick? Who told you what you were worth? And what might change if you gently, firmly took it back? The truth is, the moment you start measuring yourself by your own standards, instead of anyone else's, that's when your real story begins. Renata's story wasn't about a divorce or an inheritance. It was about remembering who she was all along. And that, my friend, is a lesson worth taking to heart. Thank you for watching Renata's journey unfold. If her story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and hit the like button to support the content. Drop a comment below. What lesson hit hardest for you? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.